Now, this is the fourth session that we are going to start, and the topic of the fourth session is the authoritarian regime of PRC, challenges to democratic institutions and human rights. And this session will be chaired by Madam Yoshiko Sakurai, President of Japan Institute for National Fundamentals. Sakurai Yoshiko Sensei, yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Domo.
日本語で話をさせていただきます。皆様こんにちは。私は国家基本問題研究所というシンクタンクを18年間主催してまいりました。その中でとりわけ中国に注目をしてまいりました。もう数十年前から我が国の一番の脅威は中国であるという認識があったからです。そして2011年に亡くなりました安倍晋三元総理やこの日本のチベット議連の会長をしておりました下村博文先生やそれから山谷恵理子先生らと一緒に2011年の秋インドを訪ねその先のダラムサラに行って初めて法皇様に直にお目にかかりました。その時はちょうど法皇様が政治のリーダーシップを他の方々に担っていただこうというそのプロセスの中でちょうど新しく首席大臣に選ばれたロブサン・センゲさんにもお会いいたしました。そこで私は安倍総理がダライ・ラマ法皇様にぜひ日本においでになってくださるようにセンゲさんにも日本においでになってくださるように日本は大歓迎いたしますというメッセージをお二方にお伝えしてそれをきっかけに我が国におけるチベット議員連盟が結成されそしてご承知のように今世界最大規模の議員連盟になっております。私と私のシンクタンクの国家基本問題研究所がチベット問題に少なからずコミットしてまいりました。今日このような場でこの部会を司会させていただくことを大変な名誉と考えております。私どもは現在の中国がこれまでにないような強力な圧力を軍事的にも文化的にも人権の面でも実行していると捉えています。少し前までは中国のメンツを保つために少し遠慮しているところがあったと思いますがもはや誰も恐れない何も遠慮しないというような態度であると捉えております。中国の脅威は人権においても経済においても軍事においても台湾有事においても新たな危機に入ったと認識しています。そしてチベットに対して行ったことをいろんな国々に行おうとしています。例えば日本は世界第3、第4の経済大国でそれなりに民主主義が発達し軍事力もあります。それなりの存在感を持っている国でありますけれども例えば中国がチベットを再造という別の名前で呼び始めたように中国は我が国の紛れもない領土であります沖縄を琉球と呼びます。そして沖縄の領有権はどこが持っているのかはっきりしていないという学説を打ち立てております。 彼らは中国国内に琉球研究所というものを作りまして、もともと琉球は中国の文化的影響のもとに強く染められているので、中国の領土だという論理を展開し始めております。習近平主席が約2年ほど前にこのことについて特別の指示を出しました。それ以来中国では沖縄は琉球であり、もともと中国に所属しているのだというアカデミズムにおける研究論文が作られ始めております。これはチベットに対して行ったこと、ウイグルに対して行ったこと、そしてブータンやインドのアルナチャルプラデッシュに対して行っていることと全く同じであります。私は軍事的な脅威もさることながら、この文化的な脅威、アカデミズムの改ざんによる脅威というものは非常に深刻だと捉えております。このプロセスの中でいかなる人権も尊重されていない、このような国が私たちの目の前に立ちはだかっているわけでありますから、今日のこのチベット会議はとりわけ重要なものであると認識をしております。今日はこのお二方の専門家を招いてそのセッションをさせていただきます。お一人はエルナン・デ・バレンヌさん、元国連のマイノリティ問題特別報告者であります。もう一人は笠井哲弘さん、日本におけるヒューマン・ライツ・ウォッチ、これは世界的に有名な人権擁護組織でございますが、その日本代表をしておられるこのお二方にまずお話を伺いたいと思います。まずフェルナンデ・バレンヌさんからよろしくお願いいたします。
Many thanks, Madame Moderator. Domo arigato. Bonjour tout le monde. Konnichiwa. I haven't touched it. Let me begin with two words. 1 million. Perhaps 1 million Tibetan children are separated from their families and communities for most of their childhood, and they are sent to residential boarding schools against their wills. At the end of 2022, I presented as UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues alongside colleagues a report expressing grave concerns over the treatment of Tibetan school children, taught almost exclusively in Putonghua Mandarin, isolated from their culture, religion, and traditions, prohibited from being taught in the Tibetan language, all part of official policies which involve violations of the right to education without discrimination, of private and family life, of freedom of expression, and clearly and intentionally aim at their forced assimilation. We've seen this before in history. If you want to erase a minority or indigenous people, you can eliminate them physically. This is what we call criminal genocide in international law. Or you can erase what makes them a people: their language, their rich culture, their religion, by taking away their children, which is also one of the actions of the crime of genocide in international law. In other words, to be very clear, if blunt, you erase Tibetans by making them Chinese. It's a modern twist on the saying used with indigenous people in the past, also in the United States, also when indigenous children were separated from their families and sent to boarding schools. And this was done in other countries also in the past, like Canada and Australia. And I'll use the expression, the historical expression at the time, kill the Indian, but save the man. This is what is now happening in China, but at a scale never seen before. The world has never seen such a massive, well-organized effort to erase a whole people by quote-unquote modern means. Within 2 generations, if this continues, much of the culture and language, much of what makes up the identities of Tibetan people are, and also in the case of Uyghurs and Mongolians, are going to be at risk by removing children from their families and forcing them not to speak their own language or enjoy their own culture or practice their own religion. Because of massive, unprecedented scale of grave violations of a large number of fundamental human rights. A new report released just a few days ago by the Tibet Action Institute called When They Came to Take Our Children describes the abuses, mistreatment, and consequences of these harmful official policies. And copies are available at the table outside this room. This new report should be used further by international, to gather international attention and have all United Nations mechanism to intervene again and get greater coverage by mass media, as occurred when I first intervened at the end of 2022. This is needed because many people, even governments, I think are in denial. They simply cannot get their minds wrapped around the idea of 1 million children being removed from their families for most of their childhood. Democracies and human rights are threatened also. When the rules of the international community, international law, the rules of, well, equality, justice, and human dignity no longer prevail and are trampled with impunity, almost. Because if massive, grave human rights violations and international law are so easily ignored, especially when it comes to children, we will have a world of might makes right, of power with no limits and no consequences, where autocratic regimes will act as if they are not limited by democratic values, law, or human rights. Eventually, even democracies themselves will be undermined and threatened in a world where authoritarian nationalist governments will flourish. There are no consequences to ignoring the basic principles of law and humanity which were adopted after the Second World War. That is what we are talking about. As Gandhi wrote, non-cooperation with evil is as necessary as cooperation with good. It was evil when Jews were targeted by Germany for extermination during the Shoah, the Holocaust. It is evil when Israel is trying to eliminate Palestinians in Gaza. And it is evil when China takes away 1 million Tibetan children to erase these people's language, religion, and culture. As parliamentarians, it is absolutely essential to resist the rise of these forces and policies of oppression, which are a direct result of authoritarian nationalism that will also undermine and threaten, eventually, democratic institutions themselves and universal human rights values and principles. Defending democratic institutions and human rights means not permitting such massive and serious grave violations, not allowing this to continue without consequences or even international attention. And let me end by illustrating why removing 1 million Tibetan children from their families so that they are assimilated against their will is not only harmful and a massive violation of human rights, but a threat to democratic institutions and international law. Many of you will know the famous quote from a German pastor about the Holocaust, the events before the Second World War, which led directly to the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Unless parliamentarians, governments, and all of us believe in democratic institutions and human rights, speak up and act against the targeting of Tibetans in order to erase their identity, language, religion, and culture by taking away 1 million children from their families and communities. If we don't act in a concerted way, comprehensive way, then we run the risk of eventually being the ones who will find themselves alone and unable to resist the wave of authoritarianism, which is undermining democracy, international, and human rights right now, and which has already started to take us away one by one. As the Tibet Action Institute warns us, they came to take our children. Tuk je che. どうもありがとう。Merci beaucoup.
どうもありがとうございました。100万人の子どもたちを親から離して中国人として洗脳しながら育てていく、そのことに今すべての国の議会が強い声を上げなければ大変なことになるというお話でした。次の話を聞いて質問はその後にということでよろしいですか。ありがとうございます。では次にこのヒューマン・ライツ・ウォッチの葛西さんにお願いしたいと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。
よろしくお願いします。I'm going to speak in English, if that's okay. Hello everyone. My name is Teppei Kasai. I'm Program Officer at Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor. My responsibility includes monitoring Japan's foreign policy towards countries including China and advocating for a more human rights-based foreign policy. Okay. For decades, Human Rights Watch has monitored, investigated, and reported on the human rights situation of many countries across the world, including China. Most recently, we documented how the Chinese government has arrested dozens of people in Tibetan areas since 2021 for politically motivated phone and internet-related offenses. Tibetan journalists in exile report that these arrests typically target Tibetans accused of keeping banned content on their phone or contacting people outside China, including relatives. The full scale of such arrests and prosecutions is unknown, as Chinese authorities do not disclose official data for political offenses. The more than 60 reported cases appear related to an increase in government surveillance during this period, including through mass phone searches and the use of mandatory phone apps with built-in government surveillance, as well as a tightened regulatory regime on data and religion. In many cases, those arrested were accused of keeping banned content on their phones or sharing it online. Such banned content typically includes references to Tibetan religious figures, particularly the exiled spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, and expressions of pro-Tibetan sentiment. Chinese authorities have applied the ambiguous language of the law broadly. In one case, a man was arrested for setting up a WeChat group celebrating the birthdays of 80-year-old Buddhist monks. The police said it was illegal to form such a chat group without permission. Tibetans have also been arrested for posting content online that the police deem to be promoting the use of Tibetan language and opposing the Chinese government's language policy in primary schools, which replaces Tibetan with Mandarin Chinese as the medium of instruction. The authorities have closed down several Tibetan language websites hosting cultural and educational content since 2020. A leading Tibetan webmaster, Bumpa Gyao, was sentenced to 7 years in prison in 2022 for engaging in unspecified illegal activities after he offered technical support to Tibetan cultural and education websites. Chinese authorities have also arrested Tibetans for using their electronic devices to contact people outside of China and for sharing information about Tibet abroad. Those arrested have been prosecuted and received lengthy prison sentences for such activities. In 2021, Human Rights Watch documented the arrest of 4 monks in southwest Tibet who were sentenced to up to 20 years in prison for contacting Tibetan monks of the same monastic order living in Nepal. It is often unclear what happened to people who have been arrested, given the extreme information controls in the region. However, in the few cases where information was available, some of those arrested were imprisoned, mistreated, and tortured. In a particularly egregious case, a 38-year-old monk named Loso from Lhasa's Sera Monastery was beaten and died from his injuries in May 2024. Tibetan exile media reported that he had been arrested for allegedly collecting and sending information abroad. Last month also marked 30 years since Chinese authorities forcibly disappeared the 11th Panchen Lama, Gendun Choki Nyima, and his parents on May 17, 1995. 20 years after his disappearance, in 2015, the Chinese authorities claimed that Gendun Choki Nyima was living normally and does not want to be disturbed by anyone. Over the next decade, the Chinese government tightened its grip over Tibet, which includes the Tibet Autonomous Region and the neighboring Tibetan autonomous areas within Qinghai, Sichuan, Gansu, and Yunnan provinces. As we are joined today by Japanese lawmakers, it's a great opportunity to remind them that such challenges to human rights by the Chinese government is also happening right here in Japan. Last year, Human Rights Watch interviewed dozens of people in Japan who are originally from China, including those from Tibet. We found that Chinese authorities, including the police, had harassed many of them and their relatives back home and told them to end their political activities in Japan. In one case, a person from Tibet who promotes Tibetan culture in Japan said that when they went to the Chinese embassy in Tokyo to renew their passport, embassy officials urged them and told them that they needed to return to Tibet to do so. The person rejected the embassy's recommendation, fearing they would be detained or face punishment upon return. Unfortunately, the Japanese government does not have a mechanism through which victims of transnational repression by the Chinese government can report their experiences. To further understand the scale of the Chinese government's attempt to intimidate critics and the Chinese diaspora in Japan, it's necessary for the Japanese government to urgently establish such a mechanism and use that information to firmly protest against China's encroachment on basic freedoms in Japan. It's also crucial that the Japanese government publicly rebuke the Chinese government's human rights abuses within China, including against Tibetans. Thank you so much.
ありがとうございました。笠井さんのお
Thank
話
you
は
very much. Mr. Kasai's
日本の
speech
法律
was
が
about the
中
fact
国
that
の
the Japanese laws
日
and
本にお
acts
けるチベット人だけでは
regarding
なくウイグル
China,
人も
and not only
モンゴルの
Tibetans but in Japan, but also the
非
Uyghur
常に
and the
中
Mongol
国の
people
関係に
in
よってその
Japan
圧力を受けている
by
そのことに
under
対し
huge
て
pressure by
我が
the
国には
Chinese
法律的に
evil
対処する
plans. And
方策が非常
Japan
に
has
弱
a
いということ
very
を
weak mechanism to counter those activities on the part of Japan, China with the Japanese legal power. I think that was the message of Mr. Kasai. So China brings its own police enforcement authorities abroad and does various types of repressive activities. That is well-known fact. And in Japan as well, there are a large number of cases of such which are happening here in Japan. And so that was also part of the message from Mr. Kasai to the parliamentarians gathering here today. And they are part of the challenges and issues which need to be addressed by the state of Japan, I believe. Now, we would like to entertain questions and comments from the audience. I believe that there are questions and comments. And anyone, please. Yes, please.
どうぞどうぞその女性の方そして男性の方によろしくお願いします。マイクをあの方にお願いします。
So there are two people, the lady and the gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Els from Ho.
エルスホンホフと申します。この度、外交関連の委員会を
Brussels. I have a question. I think naming and shaming is not sufficient these days. We see that also what is necessary is a systematic collection of evidence. It is very critical, and that's also the work of special envoys like you are, but you don't have any access to Tibet, so that's very difficult to collect evidence, and it's also necessary that the area of impunity comes also to an end. But we see that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, nor the International Court of Justice has any jurisdiction for Tibet because it's part of China at this moment. So traditional legal pathways are also blocked. I've seen the example of the Uyghur Tribunal in London. It's a people's tribunal. It has been set up in 2021. Is that a good example also for Tibet to also systematically collect information, do also legal analysis, make some awareness about human rights? Or is this alternative already existent also for Tibet? It's very important also for us because I see that what is happening about Taiwan, what's happening about Uyghur has also impact in the Belgian parliament, but I'm missing a bit that kind of action from the Tibetan side. Maybe it's typical for Belgium, but we need some more from that kind. Thank you so much.
どうもありがとうございました。いかがですか。このお返事を聞いた後
Thank you
で
very
す
much
みません。
indeed.
私この元国際信教の自由委員会委員長の
For
スティーブン・ジュネッ
Stephen
クさん
Junek-san,
の
the video
ビデオメッ
message
セージを
should have been
紹介します
introduced.
まずお答え
So
をお願い
let's
します。
look at this. The answer first.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais parler en français. No, I can't do that. I have to. I really think it is important to shine the light on, as you say, collect evidence, but shine the light and perhaps embarrass, but to make sure that perhaps the truth will prevail, as the Dalai Lama said in his message. In other words, there are legal mechanisms, but there is more that needs to be done. There are political approaches that also are needed, resolutions of parliament, of national governments. I'm reminded that the European Parliament at the end of 2023 adopted a resolution on Tibet specifically, but I think also with the Uyghurs. There were democratic states, there were a whole series of them, and I think Belgium was one of them, at the end, or last October, issued a joint statement on the human rights situation in Xinjiang and Tibet at the United Nations. And I would like to point out, interestingly enough, the issue of children who were kidnapped in Ukraine by Russia was an issue that actually was brought up at the Security Council. Okay? There is a lesson there. There is much more, I believe, including a whole series of UN mechanisms. There is the Committee on the Rights of the Child. There is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who I believe has not taken position yet on the situation of Tibetans in boarding schools. There are, I think, a great deal of political opportunities to shine the light on what is happening, much more than has been done. I think my report in 2022 was the first one at the United Nations that really adopted rather undiplomatic language concerning what was happening. And we received a great deal of coverage in mass media, which I think is important because there is a great deal of ignorance out there as to what is happening. And that is why also I think the Chinese government is trying to avoid having too much information being received. So I would suggest that this report is an opportunity to again raise with all of the UN mechanisms and committees this situation, and the scale of it makes it out of the ordinary. So I would also suggest that countries that supported the resolution last October continue pressure, continue highlighting the situation, because this international attention is embarrassing. It is not making the Chinese government happy or comfortable, but a lot more needs to be done including diplomatically. I think some of you, when I say you, parliamentarians, consider if your governments can approach the Security Council and create pressure to actually perhaps even establish some kind of investigative mode, or at least take up this issue. Because once again, and I will make it very short, once again, the scale of what is happening to 1 million children, it may not be physical genocide, they're not being killed, but I would suggest to you there may be an argument, a legal argument of a crime against humanity with the scale of what is involved here. And in that case, a state can actually bring a case to the ICJ. I think there are many more opportunities that need to be explored because we have to be serious as to what is occurring here. This is a weakening of the global architecture of human rights and the rule of law as we know it, that if it is continued without countries who believe in democracy and human rights, if this continues, it will be a serious undermining of what was created after the Second World War. So I think there needs to be concerted effort of the parties that are willing to stand up and defend democracy along the lines that I've suggested, and there are a few other possibilities which I can discuss with some of you at a later time, some of which are more discreet, by the way. Thank you. どうもありがとう。Merci.
ありがとうございます。これについてどうぞ。はい。
Thank you very much. Please.
Relating question?
Yes, I just want to agree with you and add that Mr. Putin now have a criminal case, so he is afraid to go to many countries. He's going just to those countries where he knows that he will not go to prison. So I agree with you that let's try to see to that experience what we have with Ukraine, because there are as well so many children kidnapped and to Russia, and 40,000 or other numbers, I don't know, and so many children as well are going to similar schools as you already told what is happening in China with Tibetan children. Even I'm from Latvia, I'm 43 years old. Actually, I now remember when I started my first year in the school, teacher asked us, who is your grandfather, children? And answer was Mr. Lenin. So it was in Soviet Union. So we have experience and so how it was working in Soviet Union and how it works in Soviet Russia, what's now and what's happening in China. And second commenter about all human rights, what we are watching, actually we don't see those human rights in China and Russia. I still am asking myself what those countries are doing in the United Nations. If there is common agreements that every state should follow those principles, what was agreed, and if somebody is not following those, then I think they should be thrown out. Thank you very much.
どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much
正
indeed.
確な情報を
The
もちろん
precise
たくさん
information, of course,
集めることは大事ですけれども、
together is
この
very
ように
important, but
100万人もの
1 million
信じがたいほどの子供が
unbelievable children are being kidnapped,
いわゆる中国語を学ば
and
され
they
て
are forced to learn Chinese language, so not as a Tibetan, but to live as a Chinese citizen. His Holiness Dalai Lama had suggested this middle way, and the meaning of that is to have the Tibetan people to survive, not just physically, but physically and mind and the brain and culture. Those factors should be consisting the Tibetan person, so they know Buddhism. So as a Tibetan person, to survive is the struggle he is having, and that's what he had said. So as for children, this is an unprecedented matter, being kidnapped, and they are being transformed to become a Chinese. So this is unacceptable. And also, I have talked about Mr. Stephen Schneck, Chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. There is a video message here, so please watch this. It's about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hello and very best greetings to the global Tibetan community. I'm Dr. Stephen Schneck, currently serving as the chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USIRF as it's called. USIRF is an agency of the United States government. We are a bipartisan, independent commission created by Congress in 1998 to monitor religious freedom around the world and to make policy recommendations to the United States President, to the Department of State, and to Congress to protect religious freedom or belief everywhere. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you at today's important event, yet I am deeply honored by the opportunity to offer these recorded remarks. The systematic denial of religious freedom in Tibet is a core issue of our concerns about China. For more than 25 years, the Commission has recommended that the Department of State designate China as a country of particular concern for its severe violations of religious freedom, including its systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations against Tibetan religious communities. And let me be clear, this country of particular concern designation is our designation for the very worst countries of the world in regards to religious freedom. China's ruthless persecution of Tibetan religious practices and culture is well documented. Through its repressive Sinicization of religion, the Chinese government seeks to turn Tibetan monasteries, monks, and laypersons into extensions of the ruling Communist Party and its political ideology. This is utterly contrary to religious freedom. Chinese authorities have used and continue to use a range of tactics to exercise control over Tibetan Buddhists. As we have seen, they have subjected monks and nuns to political education. They have installed Communist Party officials to run monastic affairs and have altered or removed Tibetan Buddhist religious imagery, texts, statues, and architecture from monasteries and shrines. Additionally, the Chinese government prohibits pilgrimages and other religious activities and actually imprisons Tibetans for any public or private reference to His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. China's repeated interference and appointment of high-ranking Tibetan lamas constitutes an existential threat to Tibet's religion and culture. Chinese government-appointed lamas are nothing more than agents of the state and are complicit in the government's plan to eradicate Tibetan heritage. This is effectively cultural genocide. Lamas who operate outside the Chinese government's strict regime of control face immense pressure or worse, as recently exemplified by the very suspicious death of senior Tibetan Lama Umgar Duj Rinpoche in Vietnamese custody. China, moreover, has still not revealed the whereabouts and well-being of Gendun Thurki Nima, the 11th Panshan Lama, who was abducted and disappeared 30 years ago. The Chinese government, moreover, is poised to expand on its systematic violation of Tibetan religious freedom. Indeed, we are aware that the government plans to dispute the Dalai Lama's reincarnation and to announce its own choice for succession. Let's be clear. The Chinese government does not have the authority to appoint lamas. Under international law, only religious communities have the right to appoint their own spiritual leaders. All religious communities must be free to choose their leaders without any government intervention or manipulation or intimidation. The United States and the rest of the world cannot stand idly by and let China get away with this egregious violation of religious freedom. USCIRF has consistently recommended to our government that it continue to support the religious rights of the Tibetan people. To that end, USCIRF has urged the United States administration to swiftly appoint a new special coordinator for Tibetan issues at the Department of State. For decades, such appointed special coordinators have assured that the situation of the Tibetan people remains a priority in U.S. foreign policy. A special coordinator is needed even more now, given China's ongoing efforts to erode and control Tibetan historical, linguistic, cultural, and religious heritage. USCIRF also calls on the United States administration to work with international partners to address China's human rights record, including religious freedom violation, transnational repression, and other malign activities. These include sanctioning Chinese officials responsible for severe religious freedom violations and working to coordinate a strong, unified response to any Chinese efforts to interfere with the succession of the Dalai Lama. USCIRF, for its part, will continue to call out the Chinese Communist Party's abuses against the Tibetan community and will continue to encourage the United States government to prioritize religious freedom in Tibet and elsewhere. The United States and the international community must stand up to China and demand accountability and justice for all unjustly persecuted religious groups. Tibetan Buddhism belongs to Tibetan Buddhists, not to the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you.
We have
very limited time left. Maybe one last question, if there is any.
Question? Last question? Please. Yes.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Hi, my name is Chris Lawn. I'm from Scotland in the UK, and thank you so much for what you've shared today. I think I share the same concerns as every parliamentarian in this room, which is how do we coordinate effectively together as parliamentarians from around the world who are here today so that the voices for Tibet are heard loudly in our parliaments. One thought I do have, which is through the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, which has very strong voices on Taiwan, on the Uyghurs, and on Hong Kong. But we don't hear enough voices about Tibet on it. So I just wanted to hear from the panel if they thought it would be a good idea that Tibetans also, particularly those who are from the Tibetan Parliament, have the opportunity to have the voices within that group and then find a way that we can coordinate about the repressive policies of China, both in Tibet and in other parts of mainland China and beyond, and including transnational repression. Thank you.
It's a very important question. It is really, our opinions are the same, but how do we coordinate and make action to oppress China? Any idea? We talk about all this, Tibetan cause, but when it comes to the political action, especially in my country, very close to China and oppressed by China in multiple ways, our action, political action, tended to be unexpectedly weak, which is, I am very frustrated all the time. But when we look at the government, they cannot move. How can we make our government move? How can we make the parliamentarians unite together? Is there any idea?
I wish I could be more accurate. I think it is important that with a number of countries, democracies, take up the challenge. We need heroes, to use a kind of archaic language. I think countries like Canada, certainly, and Australia and others, and especially the countries that lined up in the resolution of the declaration that they had at the General Assembly last October. You already have a good series of countries, including Japan, who should probably work more closely together and try to establish an inter-assembly or inter-group to raise the profile of Tibet. So I actually think there is something there. I believe the United Kingdom was part of that. Canada was also part of this, Belgium and Japan. But it is important that a number of these countries be brave enough to defend democracies and international human rights law. I think many governments have been afraid, intimidated, let's be honest. I think this is the reality that we face. But I also believe that this is an existential situation, not only for Tibetans, but for the United Nations and even international law as we know it. And we have to realize this and not be naive, and not only look at national interests. It has to be for defense of democracy. And therefore, I think it is possible to work with a core group of countries willing to move forward with this and defend what really needs to be defended, including those who cannot defend themselves in this case, because they're not the only ones. You are next in the long term.
One thing my think tank is doing is to really spread the knowledge of the military threat by China. Our people do not know in details, reality, how serious it is. We may face the war in any time against Taiwan by China. And this is a real threat. And how real it is, we provide very detailed information through media and talking to politicians. I think realization how the crisis is real, to let people know about it is the most important thing. Thank you very much. We already have passed so many minutes. And thank you very much for both of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sakurai Yoshiko Sensei. Thank you, Mr. Fernandez, Varennes, and Teppei, Kasai. So with this, we end the session number 4. Thank you very much. Now I request the beginning of the session number 5. Please change the name tag. And in session 4, we have the topic is promoting diplomatic solution, multilateral approaches to resolving transnational repressions. And this will be chaired by Honorable Northern Dolma Kadun, Minister of the Department of Information and International Relations. I request the Department of Information's Minister Northern Dolma to take the chair. And I request Ms. Tenzin Dawa and Kitai Daisuke to take the chair.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Okay. Yes. Your Excellencies and distinguished guests, a very good afternoon. So I'm very honored to be chairing this session, which is on promoting diplomatic solutions, multilateral approaches to resolving transnational repression. So we have here with us today two expert panelists who represents two prominent NGOs that have worked, reported, and also advocated extensively on this topic, which is transnational repression. So before handing over to the panelists, what I would like to say is that the transnational repression around the world especially the authoritarian countries around the world, have intensified their reach and scale of transnational repression in either silencing to deter or to silence dissenting voices in exile. And I have here a data from Freedom House, which said that from 2014 to 2024, they have reported 48 countries have conducted transnational repression of a documented incidence of 1,219 in 103 countries around the world. And of those, perpetrator states, if we look at the statistic, the top 10 perpetrator states of transnational repression accounts for 80% of the cases. And of those 80%, China accounts for 30%. And Chinese Communist Party has been conducting transnational repression, especially on, they have this term, which is the 5 poisons. There are the Tibetans, Uyghur, Hong Kongers, Chinese dissidents, and also Falun Gong practitioners, and not to forget the Southern Mongolian population. And the methods of transnational repression tactics that they have been using is our digital surveillance, coercion by like proxy, and that is targeting of relatives, and also enforced disappearance, extradition, and also abuse of Interpol and consular services, and extensive use of sharp power, which I think NET has published a very important report last year, Sharp Power, which includes extensive use of disinformation and influence operations. So all these are being conducted by the Chinese Communist Party. So right now, the problem, the challenge, what we are facing is that there's a lack of international and domestic legal framework for transnational repression. And that framework is underdeveloped because of that underdevelopment status of the nature, definition, and scope of transnational repression, and also the fact that especially the perpetrator states, they have been innovating in their repressive tactics. So there's an urgent need for, especially for the host countries, to have a collective counter response especially to counter the transnational repression. And based on this session, we will be looking at the multilateral approaches and the diplomatic solutions. I'm having a announcement of 1 minute over there. So, so we will be looking at that. And for that, we have our first speaker, Ms. Tenzin Dawa. She is the Executive Director of Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy. And even though the topic of the session is promoting diplomatic solution and multilateral approaches to resolving transnational repression, but I would think that based on your advocacy works and research findings, maybe you could focus on that. Mm-hmm. And then if you could also make recommendations for some solutions, that would be helpful. So, Ms. Tenzin Dawa, thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister, for the introduction and the brief overview of transnational repression of China. My greetings to everyone, certainly to all the dignitaries present in the room today. I just want to say it upfront that I do not come from a lawmaker's background, as contrary to the majority in the room today. I work for an NGO, a human rights NGO, and I will be speaking from the perspective of the civil society and a lot of anecdotes and testimonies of Tibetans who have firsthand experienced transnational repression while living in exile. So before talking in depth more on the main topic of the discussion today, I would like to briefly go through some of the findings of a report that we released, one of the first reports on Chinese transnational repression of Tibetan diaspora communities that we released in February last year. In fact, there's been a number of reports of Chinese transnational repression against other communities, including Taiwanese, Hong Kongers, and Uyghurs. I think the Tibetan experience have been under-acknowledged, let's say, and which is why we, as a human rights organization, we felt the need to look more into this situation because it's going more and more concerning as days and months go by. So while I do that, I would like to first of all put into perspective how we define transnational repression, or TNR in short. Because at the moment, like a lot of the discussions that we've been talking about since morning, transnational repression is not a new phenomenon. It's been happening for decades. But the thing is that even though it's gaining global prominence, there is still a lack of uniformity in understanding of transnational repression. Different states, different NGOs, different institutions have their own definition of transnational repression, which is why when we were working on this report, the definition that we went forth with, or the one that suited best with the Tibetan context, is essentially when governments reach across its national borders to intimidate, to silence, to coerce, or even harass and harm members of the diaspora and the exile communities. And I think this definition suits best with the Tibetan situation in the diaspora. So from the historical point of view, transnational repression is not new. We've been in exile for about 6-7 decades now. And if you look at the history of the Tibetan diaspora, one of the first targets of Chinese government's use of transnational repression was His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or his Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and the CTA, or even Tibetan NGOs. When in the 1980s, the Chinese government would send people to look into the workings of these prominent institutions. But one sort of, that was also the time when the Chinese sort of main implementing organ of these covert malicious operations, the Ministry of State Security, was being established in the early 80s, right? Early 1980s. And I think one interesting thing to note is that before these early stages of transnational repression, CCP would send very low-level spies to look into the institutions. But today, you look at the situation of transnational repression, it is more professional, very well-trained professionals, and then sophisticated technologies that are being used to sort of infiltrate and co-opt or even silence diaspora. So one sort of catalyst for the shift in targets for Chinese government transnational repression was when, especially happened post-2008 uprising. So in 2008, we saw these massive uprisings across Tibet, and that's when the Chinese government sort of viewed these internal protests as something that is being influenced or even orchestrated by the Tibetans in the diaspora. So that's when they sort of really shifted the target from just being prominent leaders in the community to targeting every ordinary Tibetans in the diaspora. So today, through the course of the research into the report, we can tell that almost 80 to 90% of Tibetans who have family members inside Tibet in the diaspora have faced at least one form of transnational repression, and majority of them including cutting ties with the family members back home. So some of the tactics that the Chinese government has been using on transnationally repressing Tibetans is coercion by proxy. It's something that the Chinese government uses family members inside Tibet as a proxy to silence Tibetans in the diaspora. We've had instances of Tibetans living in Switzerland, for instance, or even in several other free democratic countries where they would receive direct video calls from law enforcement authorities in Tibet warning them to behave well abroad. So when they say behave well abroad, basically they're telling you to stop your activism in exile. And this is one way in which sort of overarching sort of tactic used by Chinese government to silence individuals who are active politically in exile. And the second is surveillance and harassment, including both digital and physical intimidation. CCP is known to have sent informants infiltrating the community through the use of its United Front Work Department to basically collect personal information of Tibetans in the diaspora and then use this personal information to infiltrate the community and again threaten their family members and also sort of intimidate activists in the diaspora. So we have come across almost 50 to 60 Tibetans who have sort of received threatening voice notes on WhatsApp, and these happened quite recent in years, in recent times, where these voice notes get sent to the personal devices claiming to be from the Chinese consulate in France, Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, telling them that they have some important document for collection at the embassy, but they have nothing to do with the embassy. So this is one way to show that they are being monitored, they're being surveilled, and they know who they are. So again, this is being very successfully used to silence Tibetans in the diaspora from speaking out on Tibetan situation. And thirdly is community control, again using using social media, for instance, to sort of there have been multiple cases of Tibetans using sort of fake profiles on social media, not just Tibetans, but accounts affiliated with the Chinese government, using accounts on Facebook, sort of masquerading as staunch Tibetan supporters, but then using these accounts to create malicious, divisive content, and then use it to amplify in those pages that ultimately sort of discredits influential individuals in the community and sows distrust even among the Tibetan community members. So this is again something that was quite common in the Tibetan community. And some concerning trends that we see in recent years is the use of sort of travel restrictions against Tibetans who've been quite active politically in free countries. So there was this, so I think it was in 2023 when the Chinese government sort of opened up its 15-day free visa policy with a lot of European countries, and a lot of Tibetans have been sort of have taken that as an opportunity to meet their long lost family members, and then ultimately we've had cases of Tibetans who have had their personal devices sort of confiscated, searched through, interrogated, and ultimately deported back to where they came from. And then, so I have 2 minutes. And then I think in December last year, we saw one of the first sort of major shift in transnational repression tactic where a Tibetan advocacy group was sanctioned. Their members of the organization were sanctioned in Canada. At the Canada-Tibet Committee, their members were sanctioned. And even more disturbingly, in April this year, we received one of the worst forms of transnational repression of a very revered Tibetan religious leader and philanthropist Tugu Hungar Doji Rinpoche, who was from Tibet, who fled to Vietnam in September last year because of growing pressure from Chinese government for running this informal private Tibetan language classes. So he fled to Vietnam to sort of refuge there, and ultimately in April this year, we received this very unfortunate news that he was assassinated extraterritorially in Vietnam with credible evidence showing Chinese government involvement in that assassination cases. So talking about impacts that transnational repression has had with Tibetan community is really, it creates an increasing sort of threat of fear and mental health sort of distress, causing mental health stress in Tibetan Tibetan activists who have faced transnational repression because of this feeling of being watched and monitored 24/7. And then we're seeing also political and social isolation from Tibetan activism. There's more growing number of Tibetans who are also reluctant nowadays to take on visible roles because their family members are threatened and again coerced into silence and self-censorship, which is concerning. And the long-term consequences is ultimately really sort of threatens the survival of the Tibetan freedom movement, because the tactics that we see used by Chinese government on Tibetan diaspora, it really poses an increasing threat not just to the Tibetan community but also to the future of Tibetan freedom movement, because what it has done is really sort of provoke ruptures between Tibetans inside and outside, and then also restricts options for Tibetan inside to flee to outside countries because of his closing of ties with border countries like Nepal, Vietnam, and Southeast Asian countries, and then also prevents circulation of human rights information about Tibet to the international community, and then ultimately weakens the solidarity network that we have among the diaspora outside. So, coming to the main topic of the discussion today, what can states do to sort of counter TNR? I would say from our experiences in advocacy for this issue, we've come to realize that there is a strong need for monitoring and documentation that is required for reporting, for documenting cases of transnational repression. I mean, from our conversations so far, we have, I think, majority of the lawmakers have had experience at least one form of transnational repression or even intimidation from Chinese government. And what really needs to, what we really need to do is to really start documenting these cases, and then ultimately, when we have this documentation, we can use this as an evidence to lobby for more concrete measures to counter Chinese transnational repression. And again, there's a need for strong sort of reporting mechanisms and legal measures that provides protection to these affected members, and also introducing hotline numbers, for instance, where victims of transnational repression can go and report whenever they face any form of these, because it is very lacking in a lot of countries at the moment. I think only in the US, Canada, France recently introduced a hotline number, and Germany has one, but many other countries do not have a hotline number where victims of transnational repression can directly go and report. And then last, there is need to provide legal and psychological support to victims of transnational repression, and then sanction responsible perpetrators of Chinese transnational repression, and again, refuse international cooperation with the Chinese government. And lastly, I would like to some of the topic is that I think it's really time to recognize TNR as an existential threat. We have seen it happen from a long time, and I think ultimately today it is not just the Tibetan diaspora that is being affected by transnational repression. Even now, today, human rights defenders globally, journalists, academics, lawmakers, everyone is being impacted by transnational repression. So what I would emphasize is that really sort of ultimately it really sort of undermines the principles, the very principles and the values of a democratic country. So I think it's time that we defend these principles and take a strong sort of action to counter Chinese transnational repression, because it's not just a human rights issue of Tibetans. I think it's everyone's issue these days. Thank you.
So thank you, Tinsitawala, for your very powerful presentation with the specific, with the Tibetan-specific, transnational repression cases, and then also mentioning some of the approaches and actions that we could take in order to counter the transnational repression. And so thank you so much. And after this, I'll request Mr. Daisuke Kitai, who is the China coordinator of Amnesty International Japan, to provide your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I can look so far, but is that sign? Red sign means I have to finish, and blue sign means I have 2 minutes. Is that okay? Okay. I'll try to keep my time, okay? And thank you very much. Good afternoon. From here, I'll use my mother tongue Japanese.
So from now on, I will be speaking in Japanese. From Amnesty International, I am the China coordinator. My name is Daisuke Kitai. And in fact, I am not a professional of a human rights issue, but Amnesty International is a unique organization, and in the Secretariat there is professionals, and according to their research, we, the volunteers, would be making an action. So that is the kind of a structure. And throughout the world, about 10 million volunteers are there, and in Japan we have about 10,000, and all these volunteers would be, according to the research conducted by the researchers, we are doing our action. And I am actually an editor of a publishing company. At the beginning, yes, this report, Transnational Repression, 越境弾圧. So the reality had been explained just now. And in Amnesty last year, May, the Chinese Transnational Repression report had been published. And especially outside of China, towards students living abroad, what kind of repression are being conducted? So that was included in this report. And unfortunately, there had been some restrictions. So it's this report. In here, what's been included is only in Europe and in the United States. So Japanese examples are not included here. And as for Tibet example, it is not included in this report. So there are several reasons. We have not been able to listen to the actual accounts from the Tibetan people. So in the Amnesty report, the Tibetan people's experiences had not been included here. But in this report, as had been introduced earlier, the Tibetan Human Rights Center's words had been introduced here. So towards Tibetan people, this transnational repression is explained in this report. But as for the Chinese government's actions, this TNR, towards Tibet people and also to other people like Uyghur. So it's a kind of a similar situation, so had been said before. In the Amnesty report, such examples have been included. And in China mainland, there are relatives. So there had been a contact towards those relatives. It's not about this Tibetan people, but in certain European country, with regard to Tiananmen an incident, tomorrow is the anniversary. So within the university, there had this student who had participated in that event within that campus. But of course, this person had hidden this face, didn't write it on the social networking sites. But few hours later, after participating in this event, the father living in Beijing had contacted him, this person. And did you actually, in that campus, do anything weird? Weird? And this person remained silent. But this police official had been at my house, and your daughter had been conducting a degrading activity for China. So you should never do that. You should never let your daughter do that. Just attending this event a few hours later, and this girl, this female student, became so worried and afraid. But after about a year or so, in front of the Chinese consulate, there was an event, a demonstration. Of course, this person didn't identify herself. But again, after a few hours later, her father contacted her. So it's systematic. And in the speech earlier, this Freedom House, it's an American human rights organization, and there was this report. And Freedom House itself, with regard to TNR, not just in China, but also in various countries, they had been continuously making a report on TNR. And even within this organization, and they would say that it's a really sophisticated, very international, comprehensive action conducted by Chinese government. So that is the reality. So that's how Chinese government is doing this TNR. And here today, as a theme, with regard to this TNR, how can we overcome? What kind of a multilateral, multifaceted approach are there? And in reality, of course you may know well, the human rights issues is multifaceted approach. This platform for the past 80 years had been built, so that had led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other parts of declarations coming to place. And there is this committee in the UN, and also there are some human rights organizations. So how can we actually utilize that? So that is the most important thing, I think. And here today we have the Diet members from Japan, so I would like to talk about the situation in Japan. As for the Japanese government, I think they are doing quite well. And within the United Nations, for example, UPR, there is within this Human Rights Committee for all member countries, UN member countries, human rights situation, accordingly they would be the target of the research. So other member countries, they can actually sort of criticize or make a comment. It's called the Universal Review. And as for the Chinese evaluation that was conducted last year, I think, and the Japanese government had worked very hard, so you only have like 2 or 3 minutes to make a speech. But the Japanese government did very well, so they talked about the Tibetan cultural rights being in a dire situation. And also, as for United Nations Human Rights Committee, the Japanese government had been doing quite well and worked quite hard. And others, as for other matters, there are several countries which had gathered, and with regard to statement in the committee, they would be able to come up with a statement. So the Japanese government towards the Chinese government, Tibetan situation and Uyghur situation, that was also included. So these kind of approaches to proceed forward, I think, is the starting point which we should think about. So in order to proceed with that, what are the specific points to be mentioned? I have 4. 1, such kind of diplomacy being supported would be conducted by you, the Diet members. But this is about Japan, but is Japanese Diet members, how much do they have interest in this TNR? Maybe that might be not enough. I'm sorry to be mean, but in the United States and the United Kingdom and Japan, I have Googled the words being spoken by those the Diet members, and in the United States, 593 Google results. So there is this anti-TNR bill, so those kind of discussions were conducted, so that's why it's been recorded in UK. 116, Japan, 0. So this was quite shocking. Well, maybe they might have been using other words. They might have had discussion using other vocabulary, but this TNR was not being come up with a result in Japan. So Japanese Diet members within the Diet, please make a discussion on that. That's my first point. Second, as we mentioned before, the traditional, sorry, I'll make it short. The conventional, the rules of human rights, and within the committee, please use that framework and please treasure that. Why? Because what I have been quite worried about was end of last year up until early this year, this imperial house system, and that might be violated was what the UN committee had made a remark about this discrimination towards female. And towards that, the Japanese government, if you are to say that, maybe in the near future, we will not accept the member of that committee. And also, within that fiscal year, the grant being used, they had made a rebuttal by saying we would not give money to them. So the recommendation itself, the pro and cons, of course there are many opinions and I agree with that, but the economical basis or the member even not being invited to Japan. So that means the committee itself being sort of made look weak. So maybe the Japanese government didn't have that kind of a malintention, but still, within that field, to make a communication in that, I think would be better. That's my second point. And third point, as for today's theme, this multilateral, multinational approach, I would say not the country, but what we would say in English, not multinational, but multi-entity approach. Why? Well, for example, like ourselves, we are the NGO staff. We would be grateful if we are included in that debate. So we want to be in that discussion as well. Of course, the United Nations are quite including not just the country, but all these entities are included. But I hope that Japanese Diet members and other Diet members to recognize this, not just the NGOs, but unfortunately, the Tibetan people do not have their own country. So country means anything outside country would be excluded. But entities should be included in those discussions. Last point. Sorry, the time is up. It's very important. As has been about human rights and framework is important. At the moment, the Chinese government is included there, and the Chinese government is making full use of that. So not just the Chinese government, but there are supporting governments as well towards Chinese government's stance. This UPR, so all the member countries would be looking into the human rights situation in certain countries. As for Chinese government, for example, Japanese government had been pointing out about the Tibetan situation, but other countries, there are quite a lot of countries would be saying, oh, Chinese government is quite good. And the Chinese government, Chinese people had worked so hard economically. Or, as for Uyghur situation, this condemnation, the resolution, including Japan, and during that time, 30 countries would say yes, but then there are other 50 countries supporting China, making a rebuttal. In China, the human rights word itself was not seriously considered, but this human rights, or after 80 years of the countries making this a human rights order, that might be kind of distorted towards Chinese for Chinese favor. But on the other hand, to change that, the China and other countries towards China, so those are the situation there. So I hope that people would make that into consideration and work even further. Thank you very much indeed. Sorry for my time being extended.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kitai, for your comprehensive overview of transnational repression. Okay, comprehensive overview of transnational repression and your 4 suggestions, especially in terms of promoting multilateral approaches, in terms of countering transnational repression, and especially the use and utilization of United Nations treaty-based bodies and charter-based bodies, including making use of the Universal Periodic Review by especially by the Japanese government. And so thank you very much. And do we have time for questions? The timekeeper okay. Okay. So I'm very sorry that so I think we will have time during over dinner, and maybe during the working group sessions that we will have much broader discussion, because I was being reminded time and again about time being over. So thank you so much for the participation from both the expert panelists, which has helped shed light on this very concerning development and theme of transnational repression. And thank you all so much for your presence and participation. Thank you. So I was told that we have video messages from honorable parliamentarians, so we will have a look at it.
Dear colleagues, dear distinguished guests, I warmly greet you and thank the organizers for bringing us together for this important gathering at the 9th World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet, especially at a time when global solidarity and moral clarity are more necessary than ever. The fight of the Tibetan people is not a regional or bilateral issue. It is a universal concern. It raises urgent questions about identity, freedom, truth, and the integrity of the international system, as well as respect for the rule of law and international law. When a people's language, religion, culture, and history are suppressed and rewritten by force, the consequences reach far beyond one nation or continent. In Tibet, we can see an orchestrated campaign of cultural erasure. Religious life is being brought under strict state control. Children are being placed in government-run boarding schools, cut off from their heritage. History is distorted through disinformation to justify the occupation. There are even attempts to delete the name of Tibet. And major infrastructure projects are implemented without the consent of local communities. These are not isolated violations. They are part of a deliberate policy of assimilation and authoritarian control, policies mirrored in other regions of communist China where minority identities are seen as threats. This policy has a clear sign of genocide. What should be our response? First, we must insist that the Tibetan people have the inherent right to self-determination, including the rights to preserve their identity, to speak their language, and to practice their faith freely. The right to self-determination is not an abstract ideal. It is a fundamental principle of international law, and it applies to Tibetans as it does to all the peoples. Second, the international community must actively counter disinformation. Truth is not just a matter of facts. It is a form of resistance. When a state erases history, others must preserve and amplify it. Third, we must ensure that no international actor supports repression, even indirectly. This includes a critical review of projects and funding that contribute to displacement or environmental damage in Tibet, as well as to erasure of unique Tibetan identity. Finally, we must stand with the Tibetan people, not only in words, but in action. This includes support for education, cultural preservation, democratic institutions in exile, and open access to information. Let us be clear, Tibet is not forgotten. And the values under threat in Tibet, freedom, human dignity, and truth, are values that concern us all. May this discussion not only inform, but also empower us to stand more united in defense of truth and justice. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Esteban Paulón, member of Argentinian Parliament representing Socialist Party. I want to extend all my solidarity with the Tibetan people and of course my demand for the respect of the human rights of all. I greet my colleagues from all over the world that gather in Tokyo now. Unfortunately, I can travel to join you this year, but I, of course, want to deliver a message that we also stand from Argentina with all the Tibetan people.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, I send my greetings from the Parliamentary Group on Tibet from the German Parliament. And I want to thank the Tibetan Parliament in Exile and our Japanese colleagues for organizing this important conference. The Chinese Communist Party is a threat not only to democracy and justice, but also to regional peace and stability. As members of parliaments around the globe, we are standing together to defend justice, human rights, peace and stability. And therefore, we support Tibet. We all welcome the Tibetans' continuous commitment to democracy and human rights. Tibet is a natural partner of the free world. We share the same values and we stand together. Let us highlight the Dalai Lama's decades-long outstanding contribution to democracy and human rights worldwide. As His Holiness turns 90 this year, we have an opportunity to celebrate a life commitment to peace and dialogue and justice. In this sense, I greet you from Berlin and I wish you a successful conference.
Warm greeting to all from Italian Parliament. I am Andrea De Priamo, Senator of the Republic and President of Intergroup Italia-Tibet, Friendship Group of Parliament. The Tibetan issue has long been a matter of sincere attention and deep personal interest for me. The historical and ongoing situation of the Tibetan people raises important concerns related to human rights, cultural identity, and religious freedom, values that are universally recognized and which we are committed to upholding through dialogue and parliamentary engagement. Since our first institutional event held in the Senate on March 9, 2023, we have promoted a series of initiatives aimed at increasing awareness and fostering reflection on the situation in Tibet. These efforts, developed in close collaboration with the Italy-Tibet Association, have sought to maintain high-level attention on key matters, including the topic of so-called colonial boarding schools. Our intention is to continue this work with consistency and determination, always in the spirit of mutual respect and constructive dialogue. Over the past 3 years, we have had the honor of welcoming distinguished guests to the Italian Parliament, including Sikyong Pempa Tsering, Professor Gyallo Tondup, and Jetsun Pema, sister of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Their testimonies and insights have greatly enriched the debate and strengthened our commitment to supporting peaceful and non-violent approaches to the conflict resolution. In July, on the occasion of the 19th birthday of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we will host a dedicated day of celebration, honoring his lifelong dedication to non-violence, dialogue, and spiritual leadership, principles that continue to inspire the international community. Looking to the future, we hope to promote a parliamentary resolution in support of the Tibetan cause, aligned with the spirit and content of the resolution recently adopted by the European Parliament with a broad majority. I would like to express my sincere regrets for not being able to attend this important gathering in person, and I send my warmest regards and best wishes for your work from Italy.
Buongiorno a tutti, sono Ilenia Malavasi, sono una deputata del Partito Democratico eletta al Parlamento italiano. Come deputata mi sono iscritta all'Intergroup Italia-Tibet e ne sono oggi la vicepresidente. Per questo motivo rivolgo questo mio saluto perché la questione tibetana, non solo perché sono iscritta all'Intergruppo, mi è sempre stata molto a cuore. La ritengo una vicenda che riguarda non solo la tutela della cultura del popolo tibetano, ma la tutela e la salvaguardia di un patrimonio che riguarda l'intera umanità. I principi della non violenza, del riconoscimento del diritto di autodeterminazione di un popolo, il valore del dialogo e della mediazione sono valori che riguardano l'intero Paese e devono rappresentare un patrimonio di valori condiviso. In particolare mi sono occupata, perché sono stata molto colpita dalla vicenda delle scuole coloniali cinesi, che ancora una volta mi hanno confermato come la cultura faccia paura così tanto da dover essere distrutta. E certamente la scuola è il primo luogo dove si apprende la cultura, dove si apprendono le proprie tradizioni e dove si costruisce l'identità di un popolo. Il Tibet però ha sempre dimostrato di essere un mondo totalmente diverso per motivi culturali, religiosi, storici rispetto alla Repubblica Popolare Cinese. E per questo motivo le scuole coloniali rappresentano l'obiettivo di distruggere alla radice la cultura del popolo tibetano, i legami con il loro passato e con la loro società. Come ogni popolo però, anche il popolo tibetano ha il diritto di autodeterminarsi, di scegliersi il proprio futuro e il proprio modo di vivere. Con questo intergruppo abbiamo cercato di tenere alti i riflettori, la luce, per motivi di amicizia, di stima, di responsabilità politica sulla questione tibetana e ci siamo presi l'impegno di arrivare ad una risoluzione condivisa da far approvare al Parlamento italiano. Partecipo all'intergruppo con interesse, con grande passione, perché penso davvero che la cultura tibetana sia un valore non solo per il popolo tibetano, ma per l'intera umanità e non possiamo certamente permetterci che venga distrutta per sempre. Si tratterebbe di un genocidio culturale gravissimo senza precedenti. Per questo motivo abbiamo organizzato iniziative, eventi e in particolare, lo ripeto, mi sono occupata anche con esperti importanti, ad esempio il professor Gallo, sociologo, noto sociologo tibetano, di occuparci ed analizzare proprio il tema dell'educazione, del diritto all'educazione, proprio rispetto alla scelta delle scuole coloniali cinesi. È un lavoro che continueremo perché crediamo che questa sia una scelta di civiltà e di dignità che tutto il mondo deve alla battaglia che sta facendo il popolo tibetano. Vi auguro dunque un buon lavoro con la promessa di tener fede agli impegni e alle parole che oggi vi ho dedicato. Un carissimo saluto dall'Italia.
Dear Tibetan friends, dear colleagues and authorities, thank you very much for your invitation. I apologize for not being able to join you in Tokyo personally at this 9th World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet because of my institutional engagements in the Italian Senate. As we know, Tibetans have been living in exile in India following the forcible occupation of Tibet by the PRC. For 65 years, under guidance and leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Tibetans miraculously managed to preserve their culture, language, and religion and they have championed human rights and freedoms through non-violence. I wish to really thank the vibrant Tibetan community in Italy for the constant mobilization and the faith and passion by which they have supported Tibetan freedom, justice, and identity. Justice and identity rooted in a millenarian history. Tibet cause, it is our cause. I wish to thank sincerely the Association Italia Tibet, chaired by Claudio Cardelli and its members. They are fully committed and active in promoting the Tibetan traditions and human rights culture. Together with our Tibetan friends in Rome, we recently paid tribute to a long-standing supporter of Tibet, the late Honorable Marco Pannella, member of the European Parliament and a long-time strong and close friend of His Holiness. Italy has two main cultural centers, the House of Tibet and the Orazio in Tibet Museum in Emilia-Romagna region, and two main Buddhist centers, the Geppeling Institute in Milan and the Lama Tsong Kappa Institute in Tuscany. Overall, there are over 40 Buddhist centers across Italy. Each center provides a place of meditation, spirituality, and freedom, where everyone is welcome and has the opportunity to learn the Tibetan history and meet the tradition. As His Holiness is about to turn 90 years, his exemplary teachings and extraordinary dedication for Tibet culture, human rights, and freedom are a reflection of the courage of the Tibetan people. This is why it is crucial that the Dalai Lama's compassion and determination be passed on to future generations of Tibetans. And in this respect, residential schools set up by the Chinese Communist Party, where hundreds of thousands of Tibetan children are confined, is a top concern to all of us. Kids are taken away from their families, stripped of their Tibetan identity, indoctrinated with official Chinese values in Mandarin language exclusively. This is Xi Jinping project, absorbing Tibetans into a nation united around the Communist Party, and sadly, while the world is increasingly embracing pluralism, China is collecting poisoned fruits of one party, one culture, one language, one ethnicity state. A few years ago, the Dalai Lama said at the Council of Europe, and I quote, "This is the time of the rule of law, not the rule of one man." These words are the lost star in a world where challenges to freedom and human rights are all but disappearing. I send you all my warmest wishes for the success of your important mission. Long live Tibet and your outstanding mission for a free world. Thank you.
Thank you. So with this, we end the session number 5. So I would like to thank the Honorable Kalun Nonzu Domala and Tenzin Dawa and Kitai Daskwe. Thank you very much.